Well, this is fascinating. There are some echoes in my presentation that you will see from Yahya and from Lena's. We've never met before, but it's just there is some kind of a synchronicity here. But there are also some sort of personal identification with what some of Yahya had said. I'm a migrant in Sweden, the son of migrants to Britain who are the son and daughter of displaced grandparents. So what does that make me? What your name evokes and all of that. But I've actually worked out a definition that you might be interested in. If you move from the north to the south, you're an expat. If you move from the south to the north, you're a migrant, even if you are a UN Secretary General. And if you get rescued off the coast of Lampedusa, you're nobody. It's as simple as that. I don't work on migration, I work on displacement. But when it comes to something like environmental displacement, which is actually or environmental population movement, then I would like this presentation to be a game. So we'll play a game called Spot the Discipline. And by the end, no, I'm serious. And by the end of the presentation, just note down, actually, what do you think each and every part of this presentation kind of evokes in you, and what kind of disciplines are needed to actually get to grips to understand what environmentally induced population movement actually means. Because there will be sort of some issues that Yahya touched upon. There will be quite a bit on the direct causality that Lena was sort of implicitly attacked on. I want to show you a few images sort of first. So Ellis Island, that all came out in one go. Okay, never mind. The one to the top, migrants off sort of Ellis Island. You're very familiar with this sort of early movements of migration to the United States, early century. But look at sort of to the one to the far right, and that's what was on the sort of internet at the time. And that sort of gives you an idea, because there is something also to be said about all of those who are sort of harking back on the good old days when there was none of this stuff. No, there was a lot of that stuff. And then you've got Second World War Jewish refugees to St. Louis, bottom left, right here. And then you've got Breitbart on the other side. And it's very interesting when they actually sort of invoke or evoke that this whole... So when anti-Semitism is not an issue and when it is an issue. So at that time, the Syrians are not like sort of the Jewish refugees. And then you get to sort of to the one in the middle. So who is on that boat? Can we actually tell? Because that is part of the issue. That is part of the problem. Are these economic migrants? Are these environmentally displaced people? Are they refugees? What are they? Who are they? And where do they actually come from? Well, we know a little bit of sort of where they come from, and sort of Yahya showed a lot more about this. And that's what I want to do sort of in the next sort of 20 minutes or half an hour, is just kind of unpack, just look at the complexity of environmental movement in general. Look at what sort of some of the challenges that studying a phenomena like this actually involves, what the consequences of it are, and sort of just throw in some policy recommendations at the end. So the first part is there is no conclusive evidence. There isn't. A lot of the work that has been done, and it's been going on for quite some time. Sort of Richard Black, Dominic Neveton, a lot of the people who started this kind of work on migration, there isn't a direct causal relationships or any links to be established, and kind of we've moved on from that. There is a consensus that there are sort of multiple drivers into this. How they interact with each other is very contextual and has more to do with the location rather than with the drivers themselves. The impact, so in environmentally induced population movement, we normally talk about the consequences of the consequences. So the impact is mediated actually through governance, adaptive capacity of people. We'll look into that. Poverty, inequality, legacy of past conflict. All of these are present in different configurations in different places. And then the kind of responses that people have in situ or in location, if it takes the form of sort of maladaptation to this environmental change, could also be a factor. There are certain things that we know, and there are certain things that we don't know. So we know very little, actually, about the interplay between environmental change, ecosystems, socioeconomic vulnerability, and patterns of forced migration. And each and every one of these is a field of study in its own right. How they actually sort of work together in a certain location is very, very difficult to determine. And I'll tell you why in a minute. What sort of distinguishes classic theories of migration from the complexities of population movement as we know it sort of now, and the present era from the future, are three things. The scale on which this environmental change is happening is new. So if you try and sort of compare that to not even sort of the vastly historical movement, what we have now is a pattern, magnitude of environmental change that is unprecedented. So the past isn't really a very good guide for what is happening now, let alone for the future. The second one is that the impacts are no longer sort of episodic. It's not the Irish famine. It's not the potato famine anymore. We're having sort of things happening that we don't actually understand. And human agency is at the center of it. It's not, that wasn't the case historically. And the way we respond to that environmental change determines the consequences of it. Good adaptation, good development, or maladaptation. So you talk about droughts, for example, any links between drought, and not just migration, but any links between drought and food security or famine is a question of governance. So certain parts of Australia has been in drought for over a decade. No famine, no migration. So that's a governance issue. It's not an environmental issue. So there are two games that are, or sort of debates that are ongoing in this field. There is the labels game and there is the numbers game. So the labels game is sort of one of my favorite ones. You have environmental refugees, forced environmental migrants, climate refugees, climate change refugees, environmental motivated migrants, disaster refugee, environmental displaced person, environmental displacees, and hold on, this is my favorite one. Ecological displaced person and environmental refugee to be, and we get an acronym as well out of that. So, but why are these important? They are important because each and every one of them is based on a certain framing of the problem and the issue, but more importantly, because it triggers policy responses that are very different from the other one. Environmentally displaced people generally fall through the cracks. There are no legal frameworks of protection for them. They don't qualify as refugees even if they cross international borders. And that's how I'll sort of will end the presentation with. The numbers game is something else. So UNHCR, and it's not even sort of chronological in time. El-Hannawi in the 1980s estimated 50 million. So it kind of goes between 24 million and 645 million, give or take. What does that actually tell you? What does that actually say? It really comes down to two questions. Who's doing the counting? And who is being counted? And that's why you get this huge sort of discrepancy between the two. And again, sort of back to that image of who was on the boat. There were several research projects, the Each4 project at the United Nations University Environment and Human Security Institute, the Foresight report. The problem with this is that there is no differentiation between those who are at risk and those who actually move. So you get to count the people who are being exposed. So you confuse exposure with risk with actual movement. So if you take just the kind of the surface area around the globe of low-lying deltas and coastal zones that will potentially be flooded because of sea level rise or delta disappearance, see how many people are living there, and then assume that these are going to be environmental refugees, and you probably get sort of that higher end. But the process of movement itself, the decision to move itself, is a very complex one. And this is what sort of we kind of work on. Because what it comes down to is something we call risk trade-off. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The pathways to linkages, and this is as close as possible that we sort of get to a kind of framework that might explain this. You have environmental degradation that is expressed in two ways. There's a resource base that declines, and there is alteration of sort of the natural processes. Put these together, you have hazards on one side, you have a set of vulnerabilities on the other side, you have the effects in the middle. That's configuration that would actually leads to that increased risk. Now, where do you sit as an individual or a household on this framework? The relative weighing of the vulnerabilities versus the risks or the exposures determine actually what, and when does that actually happen? At what stage in the process you are. We've also found that some movement is periodic or episodic. It starts as circular. It is anticipatory sometimes. That's where sort of the remittances comes in. But when the processes that you're dealing with overwhelms your adaptive capacity, then what was temporary at some stage becomes permanent at another. And that sort of adds another complexity to this whole issue of environmentally motivated migration. At the beginning, it could start as a temporary measure and you're mitigating a risk. Progressively, it could become permanent. So the people back again, I'll keep going back to the people on the boat. What are they? So are they the first wave of sort of mitigating that risk, or are they the last resort when all else failed? And that sort of leads to another point that I will pick up towards the end of whether migration, environmentally induced migration, is labeled as a failure, a last resort, as a failure of adaptation, or is it actually a form of adaptation? We've touched sort of slightly upon this. There is sort of, it is multi-causal. It's not just the environment by itself does not undermine human security in the absence of all of these other factors. And if you want to have some sort of taste of that, of what it actually is, then Darfur. The classic case that is always kind of rolled out as the environmental conflict. Well, that is disputed. That's actually disputed. This has been going on for quite some time, and it was one of my first sort of assignments in my career in the 1980s, and I was in Sudan. A lot of these sort of processes were happening, but we didn't actually understand what effect they had on the social structure itself. So you had two, I think I might have mentioned that in another lecture, you have two sides of the population. You have the agricultural Arab settlers, and then you have the more sort of African Nubian nomad pastoralists, the historical agreements between them for the use of the commons, of the pastoral land and water holes mainly. At that time, it was getting strained. The pastoral land wasn't regenerating quickly enough for the kind of the cyclical migration of the pastoralists, and there was sort of beginning to be tension between these two communities was beginning to appear. So a decision by a tribal leader to allow or to prevent the pastoralists from using communal resources, that would take it down a pathway. Right? And it could sort of play it out 20, 30 years down the line. But you can't actually discard all the meddling from the Khartoum government, the effect of the war in the south, trying to open up another front in the north, and all of that stuff. But there were other things that were happening. The displacement sort of, and what it actually created in in Darfur, the strong links between environment and conflict. There is a cyclical nature between climate between environment and conflict. Environmental degradation could lead to people, and this is sort of Homer Dixon's work, could lead to sort of people moving. When they move, they could encroach on other people's resources. That could create tension, that could create conflict. Conflict displaces people, and so on and so forth. There is desertification and regional climate change itself that was sort of playing in the background that sort of had nothing to do with the conflict. Natural disasters also displaces people where they go, determines on whether there will be tensions or no tensions with the host communities. Severe land degradation, and this has nothing to do with conflict or even the environment, is just mass mechanized agriculture that completely changed the landscape. And to this point, and a completely different case in India, in Rajasthan. If you ask, and Helen Greatrex did sort of the empirical work on this, if you ask all the farmers why their sort of farming yield had declined, they would, with almost sort of 99, 100% tell you precipitation. Rain fails. Okay. Look at the rain data, look at the precipitation data, nothing actually changed in it. It's constant. What was actually the problem? It's actually declined soil fertility. Their own practices, sort of the year after year after year of using chemical fertilizers and overexhausting. But people don't make these linkages. And this is sort of an issue in terms of the environmental population movement perception, people's perception themselves of what is actually leading them to migrate. It's easy, well, it's not easy, but it's more direct to actually blame it on or attribute it to environmental changes beyond their control when it could actually be their practices that is leading to that. Deforestation, rapid and chaotic urbanization within Darfur itself, and sort of weak environmental governance generally. So to kind of jump to a conclusion and say Darfur equals an environmental conflict or an environmental war actually ignores an awful lot of what goes on. Typologies of environmental migrants, let's just kind of call it this for a minute instead of these sort of very long acronyms. It sort of involves push and pull factors. And back to one of the things I think that Lena touched upon, you have sort of three alternatives when you're faced with a situation like this, which what the United Nations universities were called. It's called control, adapt, or flee. And you can do it sort of in sequence like that. You try sort of and stay and mitigate the effect first. You can sort of do nothing and accept a lower quality of life, or you leave the affected area. In another one, there was sort of three categories that they came up with in the same research. There are the emergency migrants or displacees who are sort of facing an acute situation of environmental degradation. That are the forced ones, and this kind of overlaps slightly with disaster displacees. And there are environmentally motivated migrants who are trying to mitigate against a risk. Depends on sort of the type of the event, and this we're still kind of with the complexity issue here. There is an awful lot that sort of we kind of came up through research. Slow onset, rapid onset, or acute natural disasters. Depends on what you're actually moving due to. Temporal, permanent, or progressive. And again, you can go through the three sort of steps in a lifetime. Disaster, livelihoods, or habitat change. Environmental displaced, forced, or motivated. Direct displacement, or indirect displacement. And that actually, it is near sort of impossible to have sort of like a line or a queue of migrants and say, you go left, you go right, you go left, you go right. It doesn't actually work that way at all. Because they would have gone through this, and most of them go sort of back and forth between these between these processes. But there is also counter phenomena, which again, sort of both Lena and Yahya touched upon. Environmental degradation doesn't necessarily actually lead to migration. There are cases that prove that. Senegal is actually one of them, and Uganda is one of them. And the reason for that is actually very simple. Migration is an expensive business. It's an expensive affair. It requires resources, it requires networks. And when you get to that sort of bottom line where you can't even sort of afford food, sustenance, you're not going to spend it on migration. And it tends to be short distance. So it's sort of kind of going back to the people on the boat. Yeah, they might have done sort of the stepping stones. They might have done sort of the trampoline effect. But it's generally going first to the nearest urban areas. And you can see that. That's definitely, particularly in sort of El Hasaka and in Deir ez-Zor, you can see that the first sort of alternative is the nearest urban center. But it's not Europe. And that's sort of one thing that has been, and it's certainly not international borders. It's only international borders when you're already on the border. And when there is sort of kinship relationships across the border, sort of the Bangladesh-India sort of migration. It's not the Bangladeshis from Dhaka who are moving to India. It's the Sundarbans who are getting flooded that are actually moving to India. And that border is an invisible sort of border. And you get the same thing in Africa as well, but you get it in a different context. You get it because there is a freedom of movement as well. The ECOWAS, the Economic Cooperation of West African States, enables people to move between the countries. It's a kind of a mini EU type of thing. And it's not the poorest of the poor who actually migrate. So that actually kind of completely debunks the myth that those who are coming are the desperate population, the swarm of migrants, in the words of a British Prime Minister I'm not very fond of. So these actually kind of go against the assumptions and the perception that environmentally induced migration is sort of a desperate or a last resort. So why do we have challenges in, or what are the challenges in actually investigating a phenomena like this? One of it is actually the mandate. So we have something called the paradigm lock. And the paradigm lock is between understanding environmental change or climate change, and the way people make decisions on migration. Climate scenarios work for 2080, 2100, right? That's not the kind of scenarios that people look at when they're making a decision. And it is a problem to advise humanitarian agencies or development agencies when there is sort of kind of this mismatch, both sort of in temporal in scale sort of and time, between how you can look at this kind of environmental change over time and processes that follow a very completely different sort of decision-making structure than that. So there is a mismatch kind of between these two. So they're kind of differing temporal and spatial mandates. The scenarios versus adaptation measures. If you want to make decisions on adaptation, you are looking at these scenarios, but there are sort of other pressing. The sort of uncertainty that we have, what we've got are the records that go back to when records began. And a lot of the data that you would need now wasn't sort of consistently recorded over that time to be able to compare it to something else. Plus sort of the fact that while you can get some data on precipitation or indeed temperature, you can hardly get any data on migration from that time. To have some kind of a baseline that you can see, well, if that was the precipitation rates and temperature during that time, what was population movement like at that? There is a mismatch sort of in the data that we had. The synchronicity and feedback loops between sort of physical socioeconomic scales are hard to come by. We can't sort of find these correlations in the past in order to kind of set models or frameworks to do them now. So that sort of past performance is not a reliable predictor for the future. And we're seeing that particularly in the planetary system as well. We're beginning to see unprecedented processes, acceleration of environmental degradation beyond tipping points, even in some places. Attribution, that's the biggest thing. Is it change or variability? Do people actually respond to climate change? But no, they don't, because you can't live long enough to feel or sort of perceive what climate change is. You can only respond to variability. So actually going back to data on droughts, you're actually making a decision based on an acute event, incident now, regardless of whether there were more severe droughts in the past or will be, right? But what you have is only that. And that sort of creates a problem in trying to understand whether climate has any effect on population movement. Immediate environmental change might be. And then it goes through the processes that I sort of talked about. Anticipatory and sort of and adaptive responses. As initial adaptation could become unsustainable, which I touched upon, the overlaps between human activities, so what you actually do when you move and what you do in the destination that you move to. Surprises in the whole sort of environment and climate system, none of this is subject to any linear correlations. Any sort of changes in climate patterns doesn't necessarily mean a doubling of hazards, for example. Change in pattern, change in magnitude, right? So, and that goes back to some of the work that we're doing at the moment. There are some people who argue that climate has a multiplier, additive, or a synergistic effect when it comes to population movement. And I've just submitted a paper trying to kind of challenge that and argue more that it has more of a modifier effect rather than it is really sort of hard, if not impossible, to prove that it is a sort of a direct multiplier sort of effect of anything that jumps into societal systems or human systems. I'm sort of going to run through these because you will get the presentation. The access to resources and what you see happening across the world from sort of different parts. So this is the consequence of climate or environmental change. The consequences of that to population movement is a different issue. But it certainly has an effect. How that sort of plays out depends on the location and depends on the adaptive capacity of people. Conflict and equality is exactly the same thing. Hard to kind of prove any direct correlation between environmental change and open conflict. But it is certainly a factor, and then it sort of jumps into population movement. Food security is sort of the third one. And then to sort of get to a better understanding of this and sort of kind of going back to classic migration theory, the drivers and mechanisms, these are sort of four disciplines that use and look at migration and population movement generally through very different methodologies. Environmentally induced migrations falls between these disciplines. It really falls between the cracks of all of these disciplines. It doesn't actually conform or fit into any of these. It depends largely on individual circumstances, characteristics, perceptions, and institutional factors. Race, ethnicity, wealth, all of that stuff determines it. And it very simply, sort of, are you arriving on a plane with a visa or you're arriving on a rubber dinghy boat? The viability of it, is it actually worth kind of moving? There are some cases where that sort of movement is a loss venture, not actually are there any legal frameworks that would protect you at the destination? In West Africa there is? Are you responding to an intensive risk, like an extreme event, or a very high rate of return of those extreme events that it renders the place uninhabitable? Do you have the right of return once you move? One of the things that actually stops or prevents people from migrating in the first place is the uncertainty of going back. So is it a failure or is it a form of effective adaptation? When is it a failure and when is it an effective adaptation? When is it a last resort? When everything else fails? When all adaptation options have been exhausted? It's a positive outcome. It is actually a success when the decision to migrate is planned well in advance, that it's not a form of displacement, that it is anticipatory and has sort of a mitigative effect in it. And when human and labor rights of those who move and those who are at the destination, there is sort of that kind of harmony between them, is when they're welcomed. Let's kind of put it that way. There is no doubt that migrants transfer knowledge, technology, and skill historically. That's the world is what it is because of migration. Back again to what Yahya had said, UNDES has got the figures, and it is not just substantial, it is a significant part of some countries' GDPs. If you take that away, you get a collapse of an economy in that. Peru, at some stage in the 1970s, I think at about 65% of its GDP was remittances. It's a negative outcome or it's a failure because the effect is not uniform across the globe, because not everybody can move. And not everybody has sort of the same resources that are allowed. The conditions sort of are not homogeneous at all. And then there is always that question of whether these remittances are repatriated, they're used for collective adaptation measures of community resilience, or do they go into consumer goods? Or do they go into consumer goods first, and then they can be sort of be channeled into collective resilience? So that kind of depends on that. So I'm going sort of, this is the last part, and how am I doing on time? 5 minutes, good. Okay, no, that's all I need. Good. So what we need is move away from equating those at risk with those who will actually move. It's a very kind of lazy methodology to do that, to equate exposure with the actual phenomena. Again, sort of kind of try not to look for direct causal pathways because there aren't any. Less obsession with numbers. There are still people, there is still research, and unfortunately you're more likely to get funding if you're writing a research proposal that will come up with a number than if you're actually writing a research proposal to understand the complexity of the phenomenon itself. I can see a lot of heads kind of nodding there. On sort of local rather than a global level, most of the research that has been done on environmental displacement just looks at the globe generally, which again is not very accurate. The movement is very local, and we need to kind of have a different scale or resolution on what that is. So I'm of the kind of school of thought that argues that it has a modifier effect, not a multiplier or additive. Avoid framing migration as a security concern. This is really unhelpful and very dangerous as well, because these apocalyptic narratives depoliticize the issue and they trigger security sort of mechanisms, not developmental mechanisms and not adaptive mechanisms. They trigger Fortress Europe, right? There's a protect, build a wall, but there, yeah, or help them there rather than that. That's not a very helpful one. And shift the discourse away from migration as a threat to human security to as a means of achieving it, because it can in some locations where there has been experiments with organized cyclical migration, for example. The most famous one, are there any Germans here? The sort of the guest worker scheme in the 60s and 70s, it wasn't without its problems, but there is a lot to be learned from it. Spain and Colombia had one for quite some time, and these are not sort of neighboring countries, but it can work. So the work that we've done with the United Nations University, which involved an awful lot of lawyers, because that's where they come in. So international law and human rights law. So you have kind of two ends of that spectrum. You either have it migration, environmental migration as an adaptation, or where do you actually get to start thinking about protection of these people when they actually need protection. So at one end, low to high impact environmental change, and on the other end, high to severe impact of environmental change. The people who need protection simply are the ones who the ground have disappeared under their feet. That there is no sort of organized process here. We haven't seen that yet. We haven't seen mass exodus yet. It's likely to happen. We haven't seen islands completely disappearing, but they will. Every indication says that. We've seen population moving south from the Egyptian delta because salinization happens long before the water comes in. Sort of agriculture, the most fertile land that sort of fed a country and starts becoming chalky white. Sort of that happens decades before you actually see water coming in. And the same thing is happening in Bangladesh. They're moving north or they're moving west. I'm not going to sort of spend too much time on this because you can read it. There are sort of 4 quadrants to this. We've argued for sub-regional adaptation frameworks. Most of sort of the adaptation funding, the adaptation mechanisms are global and they are distributed nationally. There is an argument for regional adaptation frameworks of countries sort of kind of clubbing together because they share environmental resources. Aquifers are not national. Forests aren't national. River basins aren't national. And when populations move, they move within that. And there was sort of an experiment or an argument of could you actually have that? Could you actually have regional adaptation funding that goes to the region but doesn't get divided between the countries afterward? Because that's exactly the same thing. The other sort of extreme is that stay of deportation within the countries, circular labor migration, and new rights-based framework. And then there is the temporary relocation status in sort of extreme cases. What do these actually mean? And I'll sort of leave that on the sub-regional frameworks adaptation as kind of relieving migratory pressures. Some of sort of the policy guidance that we put in, stay of deportation, what circular migration actually means, sort of the rights, what you can and not, what you can have and not have. And the new rights-based framework, which is more extensive and new entitlements, sort of to enter in sort of extreme circumstances, or the temporary relocation status, the TRS, which is actually already exists in the United States. And it's one of the exceptional sort of measures that stipulates that if you are in the country when a disaster happens, then you can overstay your visa. But you can't enter on that basis. And we thought of kind of modifying that a little bit. So I kind of started from what it is and what the problems with it are, and sort of ended on who needs protection and how we can start thinking about protection. Because what we have in this field is an obsession with defining and framing and counting a problem, and less so of addressing it because it's already happening. And it will already, and it is what India has to deal with now with the Bangladeshi population. What rights do they have? None. Right? You've crossed an international border. It's only international. It's only a visa law that applies to that. And we're still sort of a long way from getting to having international agreements or conventions. There was a call at some point of building that into the Refugee Convention, and everybody screamed bloody murder on that. Nope, don't touch that. And I think that's actually quite right, because it will dilute the definition. It will kind of completely destroy the Refugee Convention. You can just imagine if you open that up in the General Assembly and get somebody like Robert Mugabe trying to redefine what a refugee is. It's as simple as that. So leave that, don't touch it, and then have something else. Have other legal frameworks. We might not need a new treaty. We might not need a new convention. We might need regional agreements that actually deals, because these problems are not sort of transatlantic or even transcontinental. They actually happen there, they are local and they're regional, and they need to be dealt with on that scale. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for 2 questions.
Just a very quick question on the last slide. Thank you for a really interesting and provocative talk, Mo. I was just wondering on the last slide there, just having been working on loss and damage recently, I was just wondering there if in a way that's a way to sort of circumnavigate this issue of compensation, if there is a bit of a thought in mind on that, because someone's got to pay for this. So it's not, on the one hand, sort of what you're talking about is how we almost bring into international human rights law the kinds of losses and damages that we're going to see, and finding ways to ensure the rights of individuals or families or communities. But if we link it to who is going to pay for this, who's responsible, do we then encounter the same types of issues that we're going to encounter with the debate on compensation?
Probably.
Or would it provide a way around that?
It would provide a way around it, because it's regionally directed rather than nationally. So it doesn't sort of carry the same level of sensitivity of what you're compensating for and who you're compensating them for. Because one of the issues with loss and damage, and you work on loss and damage a lot more than I do, but one of the issues of loss and damage is, when do you start accounting for policy failure and decision-making failure in the country itself domestically? So Bangladesh can come and say, well, we are being flooded because of your emissions, right? Okay, but you've had 40, 50, 60 years of independence of really, really bad decision-making. So which one is it that, and I think that was one when loss and damage was sort of came up at the very beginning and the methodologies weren't quite sort of fully formulated. This was one of the first arguments, was what would you attribute it to, this or do you attribute it to that? Where do you draw the line between the two? But once you start talking about regional adaptation, that's slightly different from compensating individual countries or sovereign countries. You're probably contributing to a process rather than paying for an accident that you've committed. And what these sort of adaptation funds, regional adaptation funds, would look like, that's, then we can work on that. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. I mean, I like in the end when you say that we should be sort of careful to try to look for causal relations here, but at the same time, you're giving the image that it is environmental degradation that causes migration, and I think I like the last part better. I think it's like me and Vasna work in a project in Chad, for instance, and there look at food production, and I mean they have the second highest urbanization rate in the world, so people are moving to the city. And there are food insecurities every second year. But if you look at food production over decades, I mean, when we have a food insecurity year now, it's still twice as much food produced as just 10 years ago. So the food produced per person, and I mean 90% or something of the food is produced by subsistence farmers. So access to food is not, I mean, there's no connection to
That's a distribution
people.
issue.
Yeah, exactly. But people are still moving in. And I think we are losing that, I mean, critical sort of human parts of it that it's about expectations, and it's about values. And if you ask women in Chad what their ideal husband, future husband will be, young women, they would say a migrant. I mean, there are expectations and values and things that are probably much more important than the actual access to resources, I think. That's you have it in there, but at the same time it's still focus on the resources, but that doesn't have to be, I mean, low resources.
I totally agree, and one of the things that I touch upon in that paper, it will come out in the Cambridge Review of International Affairs, is where do people get the discourse on climate? What can they read? Do they hear about it? Do they watch it on television? That's it, kind of the common currency, vocabulary, and language. And if you ask anybody coming off these boats, they will tell you that. They will tell it's climate change. 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 That's in the discourse, right? And it exactly depends. And that's exactly the same as what's your ideal sort of spouse or partner? A migrant, yeah, because that's sort of the success story. And it depends on how this discourse and how this kind of narrative is framed in the media. There isn't back again to can you read or write or can you not? Which one is sort of going to win you sympathy or which one is going to win you an argument? And where do people get that from?